Hello, hello. All right. Welcome back to another reading of Under the Oak Tree, Volume 1 by Suji Kim. This is the book. Beautiful book. My favorite book in the whole wide world. Gorgeous in every way. So sweet. All right. We always start off with a note from Suji Kim. To my readers, this story grapples with many difficult and complex themes. The content includes depictions of physical and mental abuse, as well as themes of trauma and emotional distress experienced by the characters. Certain scenes may be disturbing and triggering for some readers. Reader discretion is advised. The story also contains explicit sexual content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Please approach this content with care and seek support if needed. For any readers who see themselves in this tale, my hope is that it provides you with the comfort, courage, and the knowledge that you are not alone. Suji Kim. Okay, we are on chapter 8. Oh boy, she's back. Oh my god. Yeah, these chapters are big. This is chapter 8. All of that. Holy crap. From page 297 to 346 is just all chapter 8. All right. Riftan practically had to haul Maxi back to the castle on his horse. Dazed after their lovemaking, she rode with him on Talon while Rem was led by the reins behind them. After carrying Maxi to their bedchamber, Riftan bathed her in warm water, dressed and fed her, and then lay in bed with her to lull her to sleep. The next day, as Maxi worked with Ruth in the library, her mind wandered to Riftan and his tender care of her. When they were together, he was little different from a nanny, constantly making her eat and rest more. He was particularly adamant that they bathe together, and in the mornings he would snatch the comb from Ludus so that he could brush Maxi's hair himself. Such constant attention baffled her. All her life she had been taught that courtesy, polite disinterest, and duty were the only pillars of marriage. She had never once heard of a man treating his wife with affection. It made her wonder if her father was the exception, and most husbands were, in fact, just as caring as Riftan. Maxi had lived a cloistered life at Croyso Castle and had only been allowed to leave its walls to attend church. But even those visits were forbidden after she turned 14. So everything she knew about the outside world came from overheard conversations with guests at the castle. The two people who'd had the greatest hand in shaping her worldview were her father and Rosetta. But their cynicism knew no bounds. The longer she lived outside of Croyso Castle, the more Maxi began to suspect that her knowledge of the world was warped. "You're good with your hands, my lady," Ruth's voice interrupted her thoughts. He inspected her calculations with a satisfied grin. "And a quick learner, too. I must say I'm surprised." Unsure if he was complimenting her, Maxi smiled wryly. Doing the same things over and over tends to make one faster. "We're nearly done. At this rate, we'll be able to finish the device by tomorrow." Maxi sighed in relief and rubbed her stiff neck, rolling it gently from side to side. Her initial enthusiasm had not lasted long. The endless calculations and diagrams had quickly become tedious, and now the mere sight of a piece of parchment made her feel exhausted. "I didn't know performing magic required all these documents. I thought it would be more spectacular." "Magic is one of the highest forms of learning, my lady. It requires meticulous calculation and research. Spectacles can only be expected during battle. Even the sorcerers in the Mage Tower never get to experience such excitement. They spend their whole lives making diagrams like these." Maxie paused her work and gave Ruth a quizzical look. Were you a member of the Mage Tower? Yes, for a time. Maxie's eyes widened. The Mage Tower on Nornwy was the birthplace of mages and the greatest repository of knowledge on all the continents. It had been built by the mages of antiquity, raised up on an artificial island in the Issyrian Ocean. Nornwy was a neutral territory, and its mages protected the world order, never intervening in the affairs of other states. Even Maxi, confined to Croyso Castle, had heard of the tower countless times growing up. Ruth, however, seemed unimpressed. Sorcerers in the Mage Tower must accept certain restrictions the moment they become a high mage, he said with disdain. In exchange for learning the dangerous and classified magic of Nornwy, they must accept constant surveillance, lest they disturb the world order by using magic for personal gain. That's why I left. Is is that allowed? Certainly not, which is why the mages of Nornwy consider me a traitor. Ruth's tone was indifferent. Were all mages as brazen as he was? That then, did you meet Riftan after you left the tower? Indeed, I met him not long after I became a mercenary. By then, he was already somewhat famous. Maxie perked up, eager to hear about young Riftan. Why? For obvious reasons. Ruth counted them out with his fingers. Incredibly good-looking, extraordinarily well-built. For a 16-year-old, nerves of steel. Everyone thought he was a madman back then, too. A madman? Maxie stumbled over Ruth's choice of words. He knew no fear, Ruth said, with a helpless shrug. He would fight ogres with nothing but a dagger, and he'd rush into the mouth of a drake to crack open its skull. He did all sorts of crazy things without batting an eye. I was a nervous wreck any time I had to go on missions with him. He was so unpredictable. Ruth shuddered at the memory. Maxie listened, horrified, to think that Riftan had been so reckless so young. At 16, he would have been younger than Rosetta, younger even than the Squire Ulyssean. Is he still so reckless? Maxie asked, her voice trembling as she licked her dry lips. Even now, he charges forward without regard for his physical safety, Ruth said with a heavy sigh. But he no longer takes the perilous gambles he used to. He's powerful enough now to slay most monsters without endangering himself. The only time I've seen him risk his life recently was during the dragon campaign. What happened? Maxie blurted out the question, unable to stop herself. Ruth sighed again. Sir Riftan has the unusual ability to absorb his enemy's magic and transfer it to his sword, temporarily. It's skill he gained after years of battling monsters, and frequently being covered in monster bile and blood probably had something to do with it too. So, to answer your question, that ability allowed Sir Riftan to defeat the Red Dragon. With it, he was able to cut through Dragon's Breath, the most powerful magic that exists in the natural world, and infuse the dragon's magic into his sword, which he then used to cut off the creature's head. Maxie imagined Riftan rushing headlong into the dragon's flames, and her heart beat at a panicked rhythm. Ruth gritted his teeth. The slightest mistake could have turned Riftan into ash, but that reckless bravery is why he's now regarded as the most valiant knight on the continent. Maxie had heard Riftan's deeds during the campaign praised before, but she hadn't realized how rash his feats were. If Riftan had died, she would have never gotten to know him. Their wretched first night together would remain her only memory of him. I didn't mean to frighten you, my lady, Ruth mumbled when Maxie did not say anything. Blast. That wasn't a proper conversation to have with you. My apologies. Extended time with only these rowdy knights as company has made me tactless. I was the one who asked. Maxie doubted it was the knights' company that made Ruth tactless, but she decided not to voice the thought. She returned to her work in silence, her mind in turmoil. As a knight, Riftan would have to face more danger in the future. Once winter was over, King Reuben would inevitably call him and the Remdragon Knights on another campaign. How many battles could one man survive? Riftan was powerful, but he wasn't invincible. The thought was enough to choke the air out of Maxi's lungs. She had not realized how fragile her current happiness was. I see you're distracted. Ruth squinted as he scanned the desk to assess their progress. He lowered his quill. Why don't we stop here for the day? Grateful, Maxi nodded and rose from the desk. New servants were scheduled to arrive at the castle today, and she wanted to greet them. After discussing the matter with Riftan, she had asked Aderon to hire an additional 30 servants to help ease the workload on the current staff. In the Great Hall, Maxi greeted the new hires and assigned veteran servants to train them. Once everyone was settled and introduced, she made her way to the kitchen. The winter preparations were nearly complete, and the place no longer resembled a battlefield, though it was still a flurry of activity. When they finally finished the preparations, time in the castle would slow down again, and Maxi would not need to frantically rush about. "We'll see the first frost in a few days, milady," Rodrigo said, shivering as he pulled his coat closer to himself. Maxi frowned with worry. Will we be able to finish all the winter garments by then? I am told they are almost ready, milady. With the additional help, they should be finished before the weather truly turns cold. With the impending drop in temperature on her mind, Maxi inspected the bedrooms in the castle to ensure that they were stocked with plenty of firewood. Then she retired to her room to write her daily log. With the days growing shorter, darkness fell on the castle long before Maxi finished her work. She lit a candle and walked to the window, her thoughts turning again to Riftan. No one in the castle worked harder than he did. Throughout the day, he inspected the land, trained soldiers, and scoured outside the castle's perimeters to stave off monsters or plunderers lying in wait along the roads. Then he would visit the village to oversee construction progress, hold negotiations with tax collectors, and settle disputes. Despite working day and night, he never showed signs of fatigue. Could it be that Riftan was made of iron instead of flesh and blood? Such an exhaustive list of duties would have drained most, yet he performed them with apparent ease. Maxi focused her thoughts on Riftan's resilience in an attempt to forget what Ruth had told her that afternoon. Lord Calypso was no ordinary man. He was strong enough to overcome any trial. There was no need for her to fret over things that had yet to happen. Consoling herself with these thoughts, Maxi finished her supper and relaxed in her room. But when Riftan returned late that evening and told her that he would be leaving in 2 days for a monster raid, Maxi's anxious thoughts returned. Oblivious to her distress, Riftan continued speaking. "When the envoy from Livadon arrives tomorrow with our compensation, we'll finally be rid of Rob Madajas and the other prisoners. Ruth tells me the magical devices will be ready by then. With the new gate almost finished, everything should be fine, even if I'm away for a short while." Maxi licked her chapped lips and tried to respond calmly. "Where are you going?" "We received reports that a horde of goblins has settled on that mountain," Riftan said, pointing to one of the mountain peaks beyond the window. "It'll likely take 4 to 5 days to deal with them." "Won't it be dangerous?" Maxi looked at him anxiously. "Are you worried a goblin might hurt me?" Riftan snorted incredulously. "Goblins are a nuisance, but they aren't dangerous. A goblin raid is about as dangerous as hunting rabbits, if a tad more bothersome." If they aren't dangerous, can't they just be left alone?" Riftan frowned. "It is my duty to protect this land. You're asking if I can simply shirk my responsibilities?" Maxi shrank under his sharp tone. "Goblins may not be powerful creatures," Riftan said, "but they are prolific breeders. If we don't deal with them now, they will multiply at an alarming rate. Merchants will be attacked on our roads, and our hunting grounds will be destroyed. I must make sure that doesn't happen." I'm sorry. It was presumptuous of me." Riftan studied her pained expression and let out a long sigh. He reached for her, and she fell into his arms. Nuzzling into her shoulder, he played with her braided hair. "I'm not leaving our bed to sleep on the cold, hard ground because I want to," he said softly. "It's something I must do, as Lord Calypso." Maxi remained silent as she ran her fingers through his thick black hair. She thought of him sleeping outside in winter made her heart ache. Was it the fate of a knight's wife to live with these worries always? She wondered if other nobles kept each other at arm's length to protect themselves from this anguish, and feared that she had become too attached to Riften. The next day, a new steel gate was installed, sturdy enough to withstand blows from an ogre's hammer. Ruth's magical devices were mounted on either side of the gate, large ivory discs roughly the size of a pumpkin. Maxi followed Riften to the gate to watch as more of the devices were installed on the watchtowers. A red magic stone, like the one Ruth had shown her before, adorned the center of each ivory disc, and ancient inscriptions lined the edges. What is this made of? Maxie asked as she ran her hand over the smooth surface of one of the devices. Basilisk bones, said Ruth. Maxie drew her hand back in shock. But bones? Creatures of the Aeon race, basilisks, wyverns, lizards, earth dragons, possess powerful defensive magic. Most protective devices are constructed using their bones. Maxie studied the pale, polished disc. Knowing what they were made of caused the hairs on her neck to stand on end. Ruth clicked his tongue. No need to look so appalled. They're just bones. You eat meat, so this can't be your first time touching bones. But these are monster bones. Ruth snorted and turned his attention back to the device. He secured it to a stone pillar using clay, then walked through the gates. Maxie moved to follow him, but Riften stopped her, pausing his orders to the guards. It's dangerous out there, he said to Maxie as the gates began to close. But Ruth! Ruth is a high mage. He can protect himself. Just be patient and wait here. Maxie nodded, and Riften ordered a handful of sentries to protect her before proceeding up to the ramparts. When he motioned a signal to Ruth, a massive flame formed outside the walls and hurtled towards the gate with a roar. The ground shook, and a magical barrier sprang from the earth, blocking the flames before they could connect with the gate. Maxie watched, stunned, and swallowed her startled scream. Villagers had come to watch and were similarly shocked. Many had stumbled backwards and slumped on the ground. One of the sentries guarding Maxie let out a whistle. He's always loved a good spectacle. Seeing how calm her escort was, Maxie realized that this sort of display must be completely ordinary to them. They had undoubtedly experienced far more frightening things. Excellent, Riften bellowed triumphantly. It's working. Open the gates. At his command, the heavy steel gate swung open, and Ruth trudged in, covered in dirt. Was that really necessary? Ruth asked. We have to show them that Anatole is impenetrable, even when I'm away, Riften said, slowly descending from the rampart. This should dissuade anyone from even thinking of invading us. Well, Ruth said reluctantly, if rumors spread that Anatole's defenses are impenetrable, merchants may be more inclined to do business here, which isn't a bad thing. Testing the new magical devices was not the sole purpose of this demonstration. It was also for the people of Anatole. Riften wanted to assure them that their home was safe. Maxie watched him exchange a few words with the gathered knights before he approached her. You should return to the castle. What about you? I need to supervise the transfer of Rab Madahas and his men to the Livadonian envoy. Riften turned back to the knights. Ruth and Haberon, I want you to escort my wife back to the castle and begin preparations for the goblin raid. Before Maxie could say anything else, Riften departed with the rest of the knights, his cape fluttering behind him. She watched his retreating figure before mounting Rem. Ruth and Haberon followed suit. So, we're off to the mountains again, Haberon grumbled as he led the way. And here I thought I could sleep in the comfort of my own bed for a while. Ruth smirked. Just a while ago, I heard you say that your muscles were aching from inaction. Why don't you try sleeping out in the snow? I'm afraid I must decline. That's a death sentence for a delicate sorcerer like myself. Heberon snorted. Delicate? I don't know a single Remdragon knight who has skin as thick as yours. That, Sir Heberon, is only your opinion. Maxi rolled her eyes, unable to tell if they were bantering or bickering. When they reached the town square, Ruth suddenly slowed his horse. Let's stop by the market. Heberon turned to him, irritated. We can't stop just so you can go about your personal business. Come back on your own when we don't have. He trailed off, glancing furtively at Maxi. Ruth sighed. Must you continue to treat her ladyship as if she were a contagious boil? Now wait a minute. When did I? You treat her like a persistent pest when you deign to notice her. Give it a rest. Heberon looked away, a sheepish twist to his mouth. Before he could retort, Ruth turned his horse to face Maxi. I just need to buy a few things before the merchants leave. Once winter arrives, they won't return for some time, and this would be a chance for you to see the market. Maxi glanced hesitantly at Heberon. The knight, the knight, as disgruntled as he was, eventually relented. Letting out a sigh, he turned his horse in the direction of the market, and Maxi quickly followed after them. What are you looking for? She asked Ruth. Herbs and magical stones. I'm almost out, you see. Despite the cold weather, the market was bustling. From pitched tents to temporary vending stalls, merchants sold nearly everything under the sun. Animal hides and bones, coarse fabric and rustic ornaments, meat, bread, potatoes, and sacks of grain or acorns. The merchants' booming voices clamored in Maxi's ears as she urged them closer to Ruth. Sorcerer! Oi! Heberon called out to him, but his thunderous voice was drowned out by the noise of the market. Slow down! Escorting someone through a crowd like this isn't easy. Maxi looked nervously around them as they followed Ruth. Worry not, my lady, Heberon said. The chances of an attack here are slim. That's not very reassuring. Anatol is quite secure. You'll only attract unwanted attention by behaving so warily. Maxi tried to look calm, but flinched at every unexpected sound from the crowd. Ruth shook his head at her before finally coming to a stop at a stall displaying strange plant roots, mysterious bottled powders, and thin twigs. Jumping off his horse, he began to inspect the items. Maxi and Heberon dismounted as well. Are these all herbs? Heberon asked, craning his neck to peer at the items. Ruth ignored him and beckoned to the youth sorting herbs inside the stall. I'll take 20 sigal of each of these, he said. How much will that cost? It's 1 dirham for 10 sigal, the youth answered. These are rare herbs of high quality, so for 20 sigal of each type, it'll cost 40 dirham. Do you accept payment in liram? Of course, let me get the scale. Maxi watched as the youth meticulously weighed the dry herbs on a brass scale. As each was weighed and bundled, Ruth collected them in a small pouch. He paid with 4 silver coins, and the young peddler placed these on a scale as well. Why is he weighing them? Maxi asked in a whisper. He's confirming that they're real silver. Counterfeit coins have become common, and some scoundrels have even started shaving coins to make new ones. They shave the coins? Yes, they gather the dust to create new coins, which leaves the original coins weighing less. But my coins are as good as new, so there's nothing to worry about. Ruth reached into his purse and fished out a few more coins to show Maxi. The edges were crisp and polished. Once the peddler was satisfied with the payment, he slipped the coins into his pocket and placed 8 dirham coins on the scale. After checking their weight, just like the youth had, Ruth accepted them. Tight-fisted as always, Heberon scoffed. Ruth remained unfazed. I call it being meticulous. He proceeded to the stall opposite the herb vendor and immediately began haggling over a large fist-sized stone. The man selling it appeared to be a mercenary. He claimed to have nearly died trying to acquire the stone and would part with it for no less than 15 liram. Ruth snorted at the price and insisted it was worth no more than 10. In the end, Ruth left with 5 magic stones purchased at the lower price. While he was busy, Maxi perused the other stalls. Browsing the tables, she saw beaded daggers, wooden animal figurines, embroidered belts, copper brooches, and colorful fabrics that had been braided into tassels. Maxi pointed at one of the tassels. What is this? But Ruth, haggling with another merchant several steps away, did not hear her. Embarrassed, Maxi turned to leave when Heberon answered. They're charms that you can attach to sword belts, he said briskly. Maxi looked up in surprise. Haberon leaned over her shoulder to examine the tassels she had pointed to. Many adventurers believe they grant the protection of the nymphs. You tie them here, like this. Haberon pointed to the colorful braided tassel hanging from his own leather sword belt. Maxi's eyes shifted uncertainly from the tassel to the knight's face. I've never seen one before. Riftan doesn't wear one. He's too proud to place any faith in superstition. It's all hogwash to him. There was a hint of fondness in his blunt voice, and Maxi relaxed. She gave the knight a small smile. That sounds like him. But who knows, if your ladyship were to give him one, he might wear it. Heberon scratched the back of his head. Why don't you pick one out? Maxi blinked, baffled and elated by his newly friendly behavior. Aren't they expensive? These little trinkets? Maxi blushed, afraid that she appeared foolish. When she chose a short tassel woven into a red, green, and orange braid, Heberon handed the merchant a coin without asking the price. Keep the change, he said. The merchant looked surprised by the knight's generosity. How much had Haberon overpaid? I will compensate you when we return to the castle, Maxi said as she carefully tucked the tassel away. That won't be necessary. I'm no miser, unlike a certain sorcerer we know. With a shrug, Haberon began walking towards Ruth. Maxi wanted to thank him properly for his kind gesture, but when they reached Ruth's side, Haberon had reverted to ignoring her. He grumbled at Ruth for dawdling, and the sorcerer stuffed his purchases into a sack. Yes, we can go, Ruth said with a dismissive wave of his hand. They led their horses out of the market, where it was less crowded, and mounted them. As they rode back to Calyp's castle, Maxi was able to gallop through the winding, hilly paths with ease, but they slowed to a canter when they reached the moat. Who will be participating in the raid this time? Ruth asked Haberon. The knight stroked his chin thoughtfully. Gable and I, along with some of the squires. It's about time they got some real experience. Then we'll finally be able to enjoy some peace and quiet at the castle. Haberon laughed. I'll ask the commander to bring you along. I am sure he would refuse. It's best that I remain here in case of a crisis. Haberon let out a long sigh. Aye, you're right. Enjoy the peace while it lasts, then. Before you know it, we'll be back to liven things up again. With that, the knight spurred his horse forward and galloped ahead, leaving Maxi and Ruth behind. Ruth simply shrugged and continued at the slower pace alongside Maxi. She found herself feeling envious of the camaraderie in their banter. Riftan, too, was most at ease when he was in the company of the other knights. Though they quarreled at times, it always seemed to be in good humor. She found their bonds captivating. They were so unlike her relationship with her father and sister. Ruth turned to her as they entered the castle. If you'll excuse me, my lady, I'll be off to go get some much-needed rest. I've been living like a cave bat while working to complete those accursed magical devices. Thank you again for your assistance. I wouldn't have been able to finish them so quickly otherwise. I am happy to be of help. Ruth grinned. Then I'll be sure to provide you with another opportunity soon. Maxi tried to frown, but she found herself smiling instead. She longed to be accepted in the company of Ruth and the knights. What would it feel like to truly belong? The next day, Riftan rose before dawn. The shifting of the sheets as he got out of bed woke Maxi, and she rubbed her eyes drowsily as she propped herself up on one arm. Seeing her rise, Riftan chuckled and kissed her cheek. Go back to bed, he said. No need for you to wake up, too. I've slept enough. I thought I kept you up quite late last night, Riftan teased her, his hand drifting to her exposed breast. Maxi blushed and quickly pulled the blanket over herself. Riftan laughed again and stroked her tousled hair. Don't be stubborn. Go back to sleep. I want to get up. Maxi wriggled free of him and rose with the blanket wrapped around her. Riftan shrugged and began to dress, preparing for his departure on the goblin raid. Maxi shuffled to the hearth and fed the fire absent-mindedly, while out of the corner of her eye she watched Riftan shave and wash his face in the basin. Using a pair of bellows, she urged the dwindling flames into a bright roar, lighting the room with an orange glow. After briefly warming herself, she washed her face and body with a wet towel, then selected undergarments and a chemise from her wardrobe and pulled them on. Riften did not like having servants around while he dressed, so Maxi had grown accustomed to dressing herself. Over her chemise, she donned a thick woolen dress and then pulled on stockings that reached her thighs. Once dressed, she sat down in front of the mirror to comb her hair. Riften walked up behind her, dressed in a navy blue tunic and thick leather trousers. Give me the comb. Maxie shook her head. I can comb my own hair. Just humor me. I won't see you for the next few days. Maxie acquiesced, though she did not understand his fascination with her truly unruly hair. The comb looked small in his calloused hand, and despite his size and strength, he took great care not to pull or tug as he brushed. After gently untangling her hair, he deftly braided it into a four-strand plait. I'm becoming rather skilled at this, don't you think? Riften said, admiring his handiwork. Maxie turned and impulsively planted a kiss on his chin. Riften froze, and she wondered why. He had no qualms about showering her with kisses whenever he pleased, but he became so bewildered if she took the initiative. That kiss was to say thank you, she said, trying to hide her blushing. Riften sighed bitterly. I am loath to leave. Don't make it more difficult for me. That was not my intention. He abruptly pulled her into an embrace, and she wrapped her arms around his waist. Stop doing that, Riften groaned, burying his face into her neck. What do you mean? I won't have time to wash myself if we make love again. Riften's gaze slid longingly to the bed. Maxie's cheeks burned, and she pushed Riften away. When he reluctantly released her, she retreated to the other side of the room and wrapped her shawl tightly around herself like a shield. Riften sighed and made his way to the armor stand. We will pick up where we left off when I return. Maxi watched from a safe distance as he put on his breastplate and set of spalders engraved with dragons, greaves, and cusses. After securing the fald and tassets, he encased his gloved hand in a silver gauntlets. He was dashing, and Maxi could not help but admire him. When he strapped on his leather belt, she suddenly remembered the colorful tassel she had bought at the market and quickly rummaged through the drawers searching for it. Riften. He turned to her while fastening his sword to his belt. After a moment of hesitation, Maxi held out the tassel. I bought this at the market yesterday, she said, on our way back to the castle. Sir Heberon told me that attaching this to a sword belt protects the wearer. A blessing from the nymphs. Riften stared blankly at the tassel in her outstretched hand. Sir Heberon was the one who paid for it, but I picked it out. If it's all right with you. Her voice faltered when he made no move to take the tassel. Maybe Sir Haveron was right, and Riften really did consider such trinkets useless. She slowly lowered her hand, hoping to mask her disappointment with words. You don't have to take it if it doesn't please you. As she turned to put the tassel back in the drawer, Riften grabbed her arm. Give it here, he said, snatching the tassel from her hand and fumbling with the strings as he tied it to his belt. The brightly colored ornament clashed absurdly with the blue of his tunic, and the sight of it made Maxi lament her unrefined taste. Thank you, Riften kissed her forehead. I will treasure it. Despite his kind words, he immediately turned away from her again. His aloofness disappointed Maxi until she noticed him smiling to himself. Riften draped his cloak over his shoulders and even put a hand to his face, rubbing his chin as if to conceal his smile. But the flush that crept up to the tips of his ears did not escape Maxi's notice. He was genuinely happy, and the realization made her heart swell with pride. She suddenly felt angry with herself. It was a paltry gift, and one she had only thought to buy because Sir Haveron's suggestion. Though she did not have the means to buy Riften gifts as expensive as the ones he had given her, she still could have bought him more than a cheap trinket. Seeing him delight over a gift she had chosen on a whim, one spot on someone else's coin and suggestion, made it all the more frustrating. "I'll be back before you know it," Riften said, pulling Maxi close for a final embrace. She burrowed her face against his chest and held back tears as she resolved to give him everything she could. Riften left for the raid with 3 knights, 6 soldiers, and 3 squires in his company. Though Maxie worried they were too few in number, Ruth assured her that smaller raids like this one typically called for a deployment of 8 to 15 men. From the ramparts, Maxie watched the men's figures disappear into the distance. When she could no longer see them, she made her way to the weaving room to confirm that her order of fabrics had arrived. In the spacious room, maidservants were busy sewing winter garments, and beyond their spinning wheels and looms, Maxie found a tall pile of the high-quality woolen fabric she had ordered. With her task complete, Maxie watched the maidservants work with interest. Thick fabric was spread across an expansive table where they traced patterns, cut pieces, and stuffed wool between 2 layers before sewing them closed again. They worked by candlelight and the light of the fire, despite the daylight hour. Now that the weather had grown cold, most of the shutters were kept closed for insulation, and only small slivers of sunlight seeped into the room. But even in the dim, the maidservants worked nimbly. Maxie could not help but admire their dexterity. "When will everything be ready?" Maxie asked. Ludus knitted her brows as she inspected the newly arrived fabrics. "Everything should be ready in 3 or 4 days' time, my lady. The completed garments have already been distributed, and the men have agreed to share them until the rest are finished." Reassured, Maxie left the weaving room. After dark, there was something sinister about Calyp's castle that Maxie had never noticed before. Since her arrival, it had bustled with activity. First with the renovations, then with the winter preparations. Now that both were nearly completed, she found the stillness unsettling. After inspecting the kitchen, stables, and annex with Ludus, Maxie returned to her room for the evening. Melancholy, 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 my God, crept in as she leafed through a book at her desk. Now that the castle was nearly prepared for winter, there was little left for her to do. She stared out the window, wondering whether the days had always felt so long. Less than a day had passed since Riften's departure, but she was already lonely. She had always been alone in the past, so the feeling surprised her and made her gloomy mood more painful. "You look tired, my lady," Ludus said tentatively. "Would you care for some tea?" Maxie looked up, startled out of her dark reverie. For the lady of the castle to mope in her husband's absence was undignified, so she smiled brightly and nodded. A strong gust of wind shook the windows and Worry gnawed at Maxie again. She watched bare branches shake violently outside the window, while the eerie cries of migrating birds echoed in the distance. Winter had arrived in Anatole. The first snow came 2 days later. Maxie peered through her window and down into the garden, where a layer of white covered the ground like spilled flour. Her gaze shifted to the distant mountains, her concern for Riften growing as the temperature dropped. Ludus sighed from a nearby chair and put down her sewing. "This winter feels harsher than usual, my lady. It's come early and frightfully cold." "I remember you telling me that winters here never get too cold." "Yes," Ludus said, looking agitated. "Anatole is located within a basin, so winters here are milder than most other places on the continent. But this winter seems different. A thin layer of ice has already formed on the surface of the well." Is there enough firewood to last us the winter?" "We've prepared more than usual," Ludus said with a reassuring smile. Maxie smiled back and sat by the hearth to thaw her icy hands. Since it had become so cold, a stillness had fallen over Calyp's castle, as if all its residents had gone into hibernation. Servants who ordinarily hurried about are now huddled in front of the braziers, and few merchants braved the elements to sell their wares in Anatole. The deathly chill had turned the gardens into a desolate wasteland, and no one went for walks any more. Maxi usually preferred peace and quiet, but the sudden change was dispiriting even to her. "Shall I serve lunch, my lady?" Ludus asked brightly, chasing away Maxi's despondent mood. High tone. What's for lunch? The cook has prepared cream stew with peas, smoked sausages, and pumpkin pie with a trickle and cinnamon. Maxi's mouth watered, and her hunger quickly overcame her melancholy. Seeking her perk up at the mention of food, Ludus carefully folded the garment she was mending and left the room. While she waited, Maxi opened the poetry book she had taken from the library, but she barely read 2 pages before a loud rapping sounded at the door. Expecting Ludus, Maxi closed the book again and called for the maidservant to enter, but it was Rodrigo and Ruth who stepped into the room. "My sincerest apologies for interrupting your rest, milady," Rodrigo said as they entered, "but the sorcerer has an urgent matter to discuss with you." Maxi rose from her seat. "Is something wrong?" Ruth sighed. "Last night monsters climbed over the walls. The sentries and knights on duty at the time were able to defeat them, but many were wounded in the process, and assistance is needed to tend to them all. Could you spare a few servants to help?" The blood drained from Maxi's face. Just days after Riftan's departure, Anatole was already faced with a crisis. "This is nothing unusual for this time of year," Ruth explained. "With winter comes a scarcity of food, and it's no different for the monsters. But they've never managed to infiltrate our walls before. As you can imagine, the sentries were taken by surprise." Ruth's calm demeanor helped Maxi regain her composure. How many servants do they need?" "At least a dozen, and ample supplies of clean cloth, wooden splints, and medicinal herbs, along with a cauldron to brew the herbs, a pail, brass bowls, needles and thread, and basic provisions. The wounded are situated on the outskirts of the estate, which has made it difficult for them to procure these items from the village." After listening to Ruth's hurried instructions, Maxi turned to look at Rodrigo. "I'll have everything prepared at once, my lady," the steward said with a quick nod, "and send word to the church. Ask them—" "There aren't any clerics in Anatole capable of divine magic," Ruth interrupted. "Anatole has been isolated for a long time, and clerics were only sent here after Sir Riftan rose to prominence. The Central Church would never spare a hierarch for such a rural region." Maxi grew anxious. If there were no clerics capable of performing divine magic, that left only Ruth to perform healing magic. If something worse happened and more people were seriously injured, what then? Ruth gently poked the worried crease between Maxi's brows. "Now is not the time to fret, my lady. You must summon the servants, and I will prepare the herbs." I understand." His news delivered, Ruth spun around and left the room. Maxi threw on a thick cloak and set about ringing the bell to summon the servants to the great hall. She could not leave the castle's regular chores neglected, so she chose 10 strong young men and 5 maidservants to accompany her. After giving them their instructions, Maxi rushed to the training grounds, pulling her hood over her head to block the wind. At the training ground, servants were already loading 3 wagons with the provisions she had requested. Maxi checked to ensure nothing was missed or forgotten, and soon as they all climbed into a carriage, headed for the castle outskirts and the injured sentries. Just as they were about to depart, Ruth appeared with a weighty sack of herbs slung over his shoulder. He placed it on top of the other provisions in one of the wagons and walked towards the carriage. Maxi shifted to make room for him, and Ruth clambered in beside her. You're joining us, my lady?" he asked, his brow raised in surprise. A nervous prickle crept up Maxi's spine. She had assumed that it was her duty to accompany them. "Would I be in the way?" "Not at all. I just didn't expect you to come along. Your assistance would be helpful." Ruth smiled at her and closed the carriage door. With the passenger carriage leading, the 3 wagons passed through the castle gates. After crossing the drawbridge, the carriage began to rattle violently as they turned down a steep hill. Maxi gripped her seat, certain they might topple over as the carriage lurched forward. "No need to worry, my lady," Ruth said, slowly shaking his head. "The wheels are equipped with a device that prevents the carriage from flipping." Realizing that she had appeared ignorant in front of the servants, Maxi blushed and released her grip. They rode on. tilting precariously in the carriage until they reached the bottom of the hill and turned eastward. Through the window, naked trees rolled by as they continued along a secluded forest path. The leafless branches traced ghostly shadows like spiderwebs across the frost-covered ground, and Maxi focused on the patterns as she tried to slow her breathing and calm her pounding heart. Eventually, the carriage came to a stop. "We've arrived," Ruth said and jumped out of the carriage. Maxi climbed out after him and froze at the sight awaiting her. In a wide open clearing littered among the tree stumps, the enormous carcasses of black-furred werewolves were stacked in piles. "So they were werewolves," Ruth said, examining one of the dead beasts. "That explains why the sentries were caught unaware. I'll need to devise measures to prevent this from happening again." Maxi averted her eyes from the carnage and swallowed against the urge to vomit. She did not want to embarrass herself that way for a second time. "Mage Ruth!" A knight strode towards them, leaving the group that was setting up camp by a few dilapidated cottages nestled along the edge of the clearing. "Sir Ursuline injured his shoulder during the skirmish," the young knight said. "Could you tend to him?" "Sir Ursuline was wounded?" Ruth asked, almost sounding like he did not believe the knight. The young knight sighed. "There was heavy fog, so we didn't see his distress signal straight away. Sir Ursuline had to hold the beast back on his own for some time before the rest of us arrived." "Heavens, where is he now?" "This way," said the knight as he led Ruth away. Maxi listened silently, then watched as the two men walked away. She found herself at a loss, unsure of what to do. After instructing the servants to unload the provisions, she hurried after Ruth. Inside the cottage that Ruth and the young knight had entered, Maxi found rows of injured men laying out on the floor. As she scanned the dingy room looking for Ruth, her eyes settled on the sentry lying closest to her. His injuries were gruesome. The man's arm was mangled and twisted at an unnatural angle, and his face was badly burned. He grimaced in pain, and his entire body was covered in blood and dirt, emitting a foul smell. Maxi recoiled from his frightening state and backed away. She had intended to help, but she knew nothing about tending to the wounded. Panicking, she broke into a cold sweat and stood there uselessly until Ruth called to her. "My lady, please tell the servants to start boiling water. We'll need a lot of it." With a clear task to do, Maxi was able to pull herself together. She hurried back to the wagons to pass on Ruth's instructions to the servants, who hastily lit a fire and collected fresh spring water in a large cauldron. Meanwhile, Ruth had finished treating Sir Ursuline and came outside in search of Maxi. "Do you have any experience in treating injuries?" he asked her as he retrieved the medicinal herbs from one of the wagons. Maxi shook her head. This was not the time to worry about appearing incompetent. Ruth nodded, as if he had expected her answer. He produced several small pouches from his provision of medicinal herbs. "These contain coagulating powder," he said as he handed the pouches to her. "It will stop the bleeding. But first, you must carefully cut off any clothing covering the injury and wash the wound with clean water. Then sprinkle this powder onto the wound and compress it with a clean cloth until the bleeding stops." "Wouldn't it be faster to use magic?" "I can't treat all these men alone. I can heal 10 of the most critically injured, but the rest will have to be treated without magic." I understand," Maxi said, hiding her apprehension. There was no time to hesitate, so she took the pouches from Ruth and opened them with trembling hands to check their contents. As she repeated Ruth's instructions silently to herself, he handed her yet another pouch. "These dried leaves are detoxins," he said. "If you notice anyone with a fever or wounds with purple swelling, have them swallow one of these. If the patient is unconscious, please call me over." I understand." "You don't need to be so nervous, my lady. Many of the servants have experience treating injuries, so they'll know what to do once they're given instructions." Ruth took the remaining herbs and returned to the cottage, leaving Maxi with the servants. After delivering Ruth's instructions with some difficulty, she watched as the servant swiftly divided herbs, linens, and bowls amongst themselves and went inside. Maxi followed them, though she lingered by the door, still unsure of herself. As the servants got to work cleaning and bandaging wounds with practiced hands, Maxi surveyed the injured men. Some of them were fortunate to have escaped with only minor injuries, but most were in serious condition. In this cottage alone, Maxi counted 7 sentries among the wounded, as well as a dozen civilian men, loggers by their humbled garb. Combined with the men in the other cottages, the casualties must have numbered in the 40s. The sheer number filled her head with dread. Repressing the urge to flee, she knelt down to the sentry closest to her. The man was barely conscious and looked to be one of the older ones. After hesitating for a breath, Maxi peeled off the blanket covering his body. The sentry's right thigh was covered in a thick layer of dark blood, probably torn apart by one of the werewolves, lying dead outside. Fighting another wave of nausea, Maxi used a pair of scissors to cut open the tattered trousers. When a faint groan escaped his lips, she froze, afraid that she had caused him greater pain. She quickly withdrew her hands and inhaled a few slow breaths to calm herself. Then she resumed cutting his trousers. The wound beneath was stomach-churning. Lumps of dark, sticky blood surrounded a gaping wound where his flesh had been shredded and torn. Swallowing against her unsettled insides, Maxi soaked a piece of linen in water and cleaned the area as Ruth has instructed. Every time the cloth touched his flesh, the sentry writhed in agony, forcing Maxi to work slowly. Then, when she finally finished, she tossed aside the blood-soaked linen and sprinkled Ruth's coagulating powder on the man's wound. Her hands shook clumsily as she wrapped a strip of cloth around his leg to compress the bleeding. With stiff shoulders and sweat beading along her spine, Maxi sat back on her heels and anxiously looked over her work. Is this enough? It would have to be. There was still so many to tend to. As she stood up, Maxi comforted herself with the fact that she had followed all of Ruth's instructions. There was nothing more she could do. The sentry would be all right for now, at least. With faltering steps, she walked over to the next patient. Bracing herself to treat one gruesome injury after another, one man had a bone sticking out of his arm, while another's face was covered in blood that seeped from a head injury. Maxi went to the latter first and gingerly inspected the wound. Her stomach turned as blood coated her hands, slippery and warm, but she willed herself to endure it. She had come to help. Once again, she cleaned the wound, sprinkled it with the coagulant, and dressed it. Though she was more confident this time, she could not steady her shaking hands no matter how hard she tried. The man's bleeding stopped, and with a sigh of relief, Maxi turned to see how the other servants were faring. The sight of everyone using the same method was reassuring, and it inspired her to continue her work. But as she moved on to another patient, a hand grabbed her shoulder. "It's best not to touch him, my lady," Ruth said from behind her. "We need to realign his bones first." Maxi turned and was taken aback by how gaunt Ruth looked. His complexion was noticeably paler, perhaps from the strain of healing so many people. With a sigh, Ruth crouched down next to the sentry and gingerly raised the man's broken arm. "My lady, would you be so kind as to hold down his shoulder?" Glancing first at the unconscious man's face, Maxi nodded and pressed down on his shoulder with both hands. Once Maxi was restraining the man, Ruth swiftly pulled on his bent arm to realign the broken bones. The sentry's eyes flew open, and he thrashed with such force that he almost knocked Maxi over. "My lady," Ruth said, gritting his teeth as he struggled against the man's flailing, "you must hold him down." After regaining her balance, Maxi pushed down on the man's shoulder once more, holding more firmly this time. After the man's bones were set properly, Ruth placed a hand over the bleeding wound and shrouded it in pale light. As Maxi watched, she recalled the healing magic clerics performed on her whenever her father's wrath had turned violent. It was cold and bitter. Sounds good. Yeah, she's running around playing behind me. It was cold and bitter, their magic like burning ice against her skin. But the magic Ruth used now seemed gentle and warm, like spring sunlight. With an outstretched hand, Maxi touched the healing aura, and just like when she had touched the barren oak tree by the pavilion, an intoxicating warmth seeped into her being. Ruth finished examining the sentry's arm and lowered it back to the man's side. Werewolf claws and teeth contain venom, so administer some detoxicant once he awakes. In his case, it's best if you boil the medicinal herb we brought and have him drink the concoction. Maxi stood up, shaking off the strange sensation left behind by Ruth's healing magic. I'll ask the servants to boil some immediately. Thank you. Ruth lowered himself onto a straw bed to catch his breath. He looked exhausted. Maxi knew that healing magic consumed a great deal of energy, so she left him to rest and went to tell the servants to begin boiling the detoxicant herbs. When she stepped outside to gather firewood for the brazier, she noticed a lump of sentries and knights burning werewolf carcasses in the clearing. It was a horrific sight. The smell of burning flesh and her hair of the smell of burning flesh and hair invaded Maxi's nose, and bile rose in her throat at the acrid stench. Dropping the firewood into the snow, she ran into the woods. Her stomach twisted painfully as she crouched against a tree, heaving up watery bile that splattered onto the roots. Tears stung her eyes, and she belittled her own weakness. As Maxi gulped in chilled air to calm her nausea, a low voice addressed her from behind. "You there, are you all right?" Startled, Maxi turned her head. A young, sandy-haired knight stood a few steps away, regarding her with concern. The moment he recognized her, his eyes went wide, and he rushed to her side. "What are you doing here, my lady?" Embarrassed, Maxi quickly wiped her mouth on her sleeve and stood a little straighter. I was gathering firewood." She left the sentence unfinished, refusing to admit that she had been sick. "This is no place for you to be, my lady. You should return to the castle. I'll have someone escort you." Without waiting for a response, the knight spun around and called for a nearby sentry. Flustered, Maxi tried to stop him. That won't be necessary. You don't. You need not mind." "How can we not worry when you're wandering these treacherous woods alone? There is no need for you to be here." The young knight turned back to the sentries. "You there, prepare the carriage. Lady Calypso is returning to the castle." Incensed, Maxi strode ahead of the young knight and blocked his path. "As the Lady of Anatole," she said, glaring up at him despite her trembling nerves, "it is my duty to offer assistance to those who are injured. It is not your place to tell me to leave." She had intended to sound dignified, but her voice faltered, and she stumbled over her words more than usual. Her ears burned with an unbearable but familiar shame. Discouraged, she bit her lip, and her gaze flicked nervously to look at the ground before her feet. You need not mind me," she added, more meekly. Go back to what you were doing." Before the knight could protest, Maxi picked up her dropped firewood and hurried back to the cottages. Heart racing, she tossed some of the wood into the dying fire and nervously eyed the door, worried the knight would come after her. He must think her an arrogant, stuttering fool. Eventually, she decided it did not matter what he thought. The knights already despised her, so it would make little difference if their dislike worsened. With slumped shoulders, she placed the remaining firewood next to the brazier before approaching Ruth. Are you feeling better, Ruth?" He looked up from treating a logger's broken ankle and sighed. "I've nearly exhausted my magic. I won't be able to use it for at least half a day after this. I've tended to those in critical condition, but the rest will have to be treated without magic for now. Should we call for a healer from the village?" "There is only one healer in Anatole who is capable enough, but it won't be right to ask him to leave his own patients to help us. We can send our injured to him instead." Ruth stood up and stroked his chin, trying to determine who among the remaining wounded could travel safely. "The healer can't take all of these men, so we'll send those poisoned by werewolf venom and treat the rest ourselves." Maxi swallowed hard. "What can I do?" "Compress swollen wounds with warm cloths, splinter broken bones, and stitch open wounds." Stitch? Maxi became lightheaded with the thought. "Don't worry," Ruth sighed. "I will do the sewing. Your ladyship only need to assist." All right. But first, we must send those with high fevers to the healer." With those words, Ruth strode out of the cottage. After taking a moment to settle her nerves, Maxi followed him. 15 fever-stricken men were identified and carried to the wagons for the journey to the village healer. Those who had been treated by Ruth were given porridge and detoxicants, and once they recovered their strength, they set about repairing the drafty cottages. There were 8 cottages usually used by the loggers, and 4 of them had damaged walls. With a cold snap expected after the sunset, the injured men would freeze if the walls were left unrepaired. As Ruth gave her new instructions, Maxie struggled to hear him over the clamorous noise of men sawing timber and hammering at the walls. Soak a clean cloth in strong liquor and dab it onto the wounds. This reduces the chance of infection, though how it works is a bit of a mystery. Is it because of something in the liquor? It's possible. Liquor never goes bad, Ruth said as he threaded a needle. It is a method used by the healers in the South. According to them, a wound must be kept clean, and bleeding should be avoided at all costs. A patient's body shouldn't be allowed to become too cold or too hot. Ruth turned his attention to an injured man with a painful-looking gash across his back and continued to talk as he worked. I admit that I thought this southern method was gibberish at first, but it has proven more effective than dog urine and leeches, or simply cauterizing the wound. It's still inferior to magic, but is incredibly useful in situations like these. As Ruth began to stitch the open wound closed, Maxie flinched as if it were pricking her own flesh. Making a knot after each stitch makes it easier to remove the thread once the wound is healed, Ruth explained. Would you like to give it a try? Maxie shook her head vigorously. She did not want to be seen as weak, but she did not have the stomach to pierce another's skin with a needle and sew him together like cloth. It's no different than sewing leather shoes. Ruth made another stitch. The sentry whimpered, but the sound was muffled in his bed of straw. Paying him no mind, Ruth continued stitching the wound. Whenever blood oozed from the gash, Maxie used a liquor-soaked cloth to wipe it clean, and she used heated scissors to snip the thread after each knot Ruth made. The final step is to apply a salve and dress the wound. This helps it heal faster. Ruth finished the last stitch and trimmed the thread. As he applied a generous smear of sticky salve over the wound, the sentry howled in pain. Mage Ruth, he cried, can't you just heal it with your magic? Whatever that is, it burns. I've exhausted my magic, I'm afraid. The sentry groaned in response. Bear it for just a while longer. I'm almost done, Ruth said as he tightly wrapped the wound in cloth. When he finished, he poured a portion of the salve into a small vial and gave it to the sentry. Apply this salve and redress the wound every 2 days. It should be healed in 10 days' time. Maxie packed up the tools and followed Ruth to the next patient. While he stitched wounds closed, Maxie gave the injured man sips of detoxicant, cut up strips of cloth, and soaked Ruth's needle and thread in strong liquor. Though it was her first time performing such tasks, Ruth's calm direction helped her remain collected. When he realigned broken bones, Maxie tied the splint. When she saw an ankle swelled like a pig's bladder, she compressed it with the warm cloth. By the time the last of the patients was treated, night had fallen. Bone-tired, Maxie sank to her knees and warmed her chilled hands by the brazier. Wearied by the prospect of spending the night in this bleak place, Maxie wondered if she would be able to return to the castle that night, or if she would need to wait until morning. She was still absorbed in the thought when a wooden bowl of steaming soup was thrust in front of her. Please have some, my lady. Maxie, startled, looked up. It was the young knight who had tried to send her back to the castle earlier. It's rabbit stew, he said, and nudged the bowl toward her again. It doesn't compare to what they cook up in the castle, but it's edible. Maxie reluctantly accepted the bowl, feeling awkward in front of the knight, but she hadn't eaten since breakfast and was famished, so she eagerly brought a spoonful of the warm stew to her mouth. Thank you. My pleasure, and about earlier. Maxie froze, dreading his next words, but to her surprise, he bowed his head shamefully. I beg your forgiveness, my lady, the young knight said. It was not my place to say such things. Maxie stared at him, her spoon still in her mouth. She had not expected him to apologize. It's all right, she said, quickly putting down her bowl. I shouldn't have been so short-tempered. I apologize. No, my lady, it was I who offended you. There is no need for you to apologize. Thank you. Blushing, Maxie relaxed. The knight appeared hesitant, unsure of what to say next, and they remained locked in an uncomfortable silence until Ruth returned. He raised an eyebrow at the knight. Is something wrong, Sir Eliot? No, I was apologizing to her ladyship for offending her. Ruth looked surprised, but he did not press the knight further. Instead, he sighed loudly and sat by the brazier to warm his hands. The knights we sent to patrol the walls have returned, Ruth said. It seems no monsters are lurking nearby, so I think it's time for you to return to the castle, my lady. What about you, Ruth? I'm afraid I must spend the night here. Though we have stabilized their condition, some of the men might develop fevers as the night progresses. And once I've recovered my magic, I'll be able to fully heal a few more people. Maxi hesitated briefly, conflicted. Though she was thoroughly drained and longed to sleep in her own bed, it did not seem right to return to the comfort of the castle while Ruth and the others remained here. Perhaps I should stay and... You have done enough, I assure you. Maxi's face hardened, and she wondered if Ruth found her presence a nuisance. As if he had sensed her unease, Ruth smiled softly. If Sir Riftan finds out that you spent the night in this dilapidated cottage, he said, there will be hell to pay. I've already asked the knights to escort you back, so please get some rest. You don't need to worry about us. In fact, we'll sleep better knowing that you're out of harm's way. Allow me to escort you, my lady, said Sir Eliot. Maxi nodded, unable to protest further. If she was honest, she would be glad not to spend the night in the forest, surrounded by the stench of burning carcasses and the winter chill. With half-feigned reluctance, she climbed into the carriage with 2 servants in tow. When Sir Eliot arrived, mounted on his horse, he signaled to the carriage driver, and together they departed. As the carriage rattled along the forest path, Maxi breathed a sigh of relief. Fatigue soon took over, and hugging her niece to her chest, she dozed off like a cat in front of a fireplace. In her 22 years of life, this day had been the most exhausting. Once she arrived at the castle, Maxi threw off her blood-stained clothes, took a bath, and then immediately climbed into bed. When she awoke the next morning, her whole body ached. Groaning, she rolled from one side to the other in an attempt to get comfortable again. "Are you all right, my lady?" Ludus asked when she entered the room with some firewood. Maxi nodded, forcing a smile, and crawled out of bed. Seeing her discomfort, Ludus swiftly summoned the other maidservants to prepare a warm bath. Maxi soaked until her muscles loosened, then dressed in a soft cotton chemise and a thick woolen dress. "Why don't you rest in your room today, my lady?" Ludus said as she dried Maxi's hair with a towel and began to gently comb it. "It's a cold, wintry day outside. I want to spend some time in the library. There's a book I'd like to read." "Then I'll see to it that the fire is lit in the library immediately. It hasn't been used since the sorcerer left yesterday morning, so it's quite cold in there." After finishing with Maxi's hair, Ludus left the room to prepare the library for her. A maidservant brought Maxi breakfast, and she ate her fill of the creamy barley porridge before draping a thick robe around her shoulders heading to the library. The large room was already warm when she arrived. Maxi threw the curtains open to let light in, then began browsing the bookshelves. She searched for a particular book, but it proved more difficult to locate than she had anticipated. Pulling out book after book, she checked their contents, only to return them to their place, disappointed. Should I wait and ask Ruth when he returns? Maxi sank to the floor, defeated. After hours of combing through the library shelves, just as she resolved to give up and ask Ruth, she noticed a messy pile of books stacked on the desk. And in front of that stack, she recognized the book she had been looking for. Smiling, Maxi stood and retrieved the book from the stack. It was an illustrated apothecary's reference of age-old remedies and medicinal herbs. The lands surrounding Anatole were filled with monsters, so it was likely that yesterday's events could occur again. Maxi was determined to prepare herself by studying the art of healing. Taking a seat near the window, Maxi began reading by the pale winter sunlight. The book was difficult to understand. Its language convoluted and obscure, the illustrations had faded, and some of the remedies seemed dubious at best. Sprinkling ash on bruises or soaking hair with raw eggs to cure fevers did not seem like a reliable method. After flipping through the book's contents, Maxi sighed and closed it, discouraged. I feel better if Ruth wasn't the only one capable of healing magic. Maybe she could ask Riftan to hire another mage, or they could request the Central Church to send hierarchs to Anatole. But mages were highly sought after by the nobles, who fiercely wielded their power and money to recruit the best sorcerers into their service. Ruth had already told her that the Central Church in Osiria would never waste a hierarch by sending them to a remote place like Anatole. After a moment of deliberation, Maxi decided to continue her search. But even after scouring the library for an entire afternoon, she was unable to find anything useful. She returned to her room frustrated. Ludus served her a lunch of crispy grilled goose meat, crepe with caramelized apples, and savory pumpkin soup. Maxi barely touched the food. Engrossed in another book she got from the library, she doubted her efforts would bear any fruit. But she could not just do nothing. Maxi stared into the fire, her mind wandering anxiously. Riften, like, Riften liked her now, but there was no guarantee his affection would continue forever. The moment he realized she was not the charming Duke's daughter he believed her to be, his attachment to her could disappear like a mirage. Maxie needed to become indispensable. She needed to be valuable for more reasons than just her noble lineage. If she could be useful to Riften in some way, even if it was small, he might allow her to remain by his side even after he grew tired of her. Sighing, Maxie stopped frantically leafing through the book. After staring at the cover for a moment, Maxie curled up in her chair and buried her face in her knees. These moments of self-awareness overwhelmed her. She could see her distorted thoughts as in a mirror, and her mind became a tumultuous storm of desperate contradictions. She wished for Riften to hold her in his arms, even as she plotted to make herself worth keeping. Maxie had lived a life of loneliness, but in these moments her solitude consumed her. The next day, Maxie discovered a book of ancient remedies tucked away in a corner of the library and spent the day reading the faded pages. It was written in the ancient tongue, but Maxie had no trouble reading it until she began to encounter words she didn't know. Eventually, unfamiliar words were appearing so frequently that it became difficult to understand full passages. As she read, Maxie carefully wrote a list of the words she did not know on a piece of parchment. Most of them seemed to be antiquated terms for body parts or archaic tools used for treatment. She searched the book on each of these subjects and before long gathered an enormous stack on the desk. Quill in hand, Maxie scrunched her nose as she reviewed her growing list of terms. She frantically read anything that seemed even oh my god, tangentially related to healing, but after hours of study, she still only stood half of the material. Taking a deep breath, Maxie sighed and ran a hand through her hair. Uncertain that she would be able to learn anything substantial this way, when the door of the library swung open, Maxie turned, happy for the interruption. Ruth, she said as the sorcerer strode into the room. When did you return? Did you manage to treat everyone? I returned last night, Ruth said flatly, and yes, everyone has been tended to. He trudged over to his usual chair and was surprised to see the books lying open in front of Maxie. Are you trying to learn medicine, milady? He picked up one of the books and raised an eyebrow. Unsure of herself, Maxie mumbled her reply. What happened a few days ago could happen again, so I thought I would prepare myself. She watched Ruth anxiously, certain that he would scoff at her. But to her surprise, his face broke into a bright smile. A commendable effort. He sounded sincere, if a little condescending, like one complimenting a small child. Let me take a look. Did you start yesterday? He sat down across from Maxie and snatched up her heap of notes before she could protest. Maxie glowered at him as he examined her work. One day, she would chastise him for touching a lady's possessions without her permission. Ruth lowered the pages and looked at her with surprise. You're able to read the ancient tongue? I I learned it when I was young. Before Rosetta grew into a flawless young woman, the Duke of Croyso subjected Maxie to rigorous instruction, desperate to correct her impediment, but Maxie showed little improvement. Eventually, Rosetta's sharp intellect became apparent, and their father gave up on Maxie, freeing her from the ordeal of reciting poetry every month. Maxie used to stay up all night memorizing those poems, but she had never been allowed to finish reciting any of them. Her stutter had always ignited her father's rage, and he would lash at her with his cane before she finished the first verse. The terrible memory left Maxie feeling sick, and she quickly looked down to hide her face. I've always liked to read, so I can read and write in the ancient tongue. But there are many words I I am not familiar with. Ruth remained silent as he continued to read through her notes, and Maxie shifted nervously in her seat. Why not learn magic instead? Ruth asked abruptly, setting down the stack of parchment. Maxie blinked, unsure that she heard his words correctly. Ruth rose from his seat, excited by his own suggestion. Why spend time learning medicine when you could learn magic instead? If you become capable of healing magic, it would lessen my burden tremendously. Maxie furrowed her brows. Did he only make the suggestion because it would benefit him, or did he truly think she was capable? Didn't you say that magic is the highest form of learning? That it requires complex calculations? I, I am not suited for that. Advanced magic does require years of research and practice, yes, but basic magic is different. As long as one has mana affinity, a few years of study is all it takes to master basic spells. What is basic magic? All non-elemental magic, Ruth explained casually, as if the topic was no more complex or uncommon than basic mathematics. Simple healing magic, levitation, and other minor spells. Maxie smiled timidly. I would like to learn, but as you mentioned, it takes years of work. Wouldn't studying mundane healing yield faster? I mean that it takes several years for a person to cultivate mana affinity and to learn arithmetic and the ancient tongue. But you already have mana affinity. It isn't strong enough yet. It isn't strong yet, but with your knowledge of arithmetic and the ancient tongue, you meet the basic conditions for learning magic. With a few months of practice, you should be capable of casting simple spells. Hope glimmered in Maxie's heart. Could she really learn magic? Do you think I'll be able to do it? It's worth a try. You have nothing to lose. He was right. Maxie clutched her hope and mustered her courage. If you're willing to teach me, I will do my best. I shall make the necessary preparations. We could start tomorrow afternoon here in the library. Ruth walked over to a bookcase and removed 2 weighty tomes, then returned to where Maxie sat at the desk. These will help you understand the foundations of magic. Please read them whenever you get the chance. Heart racing, Maxie left the library with the books hugged to her chest. For the first time in her life, someone had seen potential in her. That night, Maxie was too excited to sleep. Instead, she lit a candle and read the books Ruth had given her until her eyelids grew heavy. The first tome expounded the concept of magic, while the second explained its working principles. Neither book was as complicated as she had feared, and the idea of becoming a sorceress suddenly seemed possible. Maxie imagined herself wielding fire from her fingertips to vanquish monsters, and raising storms to sweep away invaders. She pictured Riftan pulling her into a tight embrace, proud of her achievements. The thought was enough to make her grin as she pored over the text. If she mastered magic, she could join Riftan on his campaigns. Gone was all memory of the fact that she had once fainted at the sight of a monster. Maxie's heart pounded with excitement, and she flopped back in bed, kicking her feet in the air with giddy energy. The next day, Ruth quickly shattered her fantasy. He walked into the library looking just as eager as Maxie felt. But his lengthy lecture on runes and magical theory left Maxie staring blankly at him and the large slate he had drawn several diagrams on. When he moved on to the governing principles of magic runes, Maxie felt as if he were speaking a different language entirely. Do you understand, my lady? Ruth asked when this lecture finally concluded. When she did not immediately answer, Ruth's brows creased in confusion. Was there anything you didn't understand? I barely understood any of it, Maxie said, so disheartened that she had to hold back tears. I'm not suited to this after all. It's too soon to give up. Ruth seemed displeased by her wavering resolve. You must learn to be tenacious, my lady. The less you understand, the more you must persist. Maxie was so accustomed to resigning herself to disappointment that Ruth's advice bewildered her. She avoided his gaze as she considered his words, then looked up at him and nodded tentatively. I understand. Ruth erased the diagrams from the slate and drew a simpler one in their place. There is an energy that flows through the natural world, invisible to the naked eye. This energy is called mana. Maxi promptly picked up her quill and took notes. Ruth waited until she finished writing before continuing. Through training, mages can draw mana into their bodies and harness its energy. This concentration of mana is what we call magic. Are they not the same thing? The two words are often used interchangeably, but they are different in nature. Think of mana as a stable force that exists in equilibrium in the natural world. Magic, however, is a force of considerable instability that was forcibly accumulated inside the body of a human or a monster. While mana adheres to the order of nature, magic defies it. I'm not sure I understand. Allow me to demonstrate. Ruth unfurled his fingers to show his palm. The mana flowing through this room is currently in a state of perfect equilibrium. But if I do this, he flicked his index finger and a fist-sized ball of fire burst into being. I've broken that equilibrium by using the energy I accumulated. That is magic. In the natural world, this fire would be considered unnatural. Its light and heat should not be present. It only exists because I called it into being. Nature fights against these anomalies and tries to remove the surplus mana to restore everything to its natural state. Mages call this resistance negation, and it's the reason that magic disappears over time. Ruth lowered his hand and the flame fizzled out. But didn't you say runes were required to use magic? The flame I conjured was created through a rune. If mana is the ingredient, runes are the recipe. Runes contain detailed instructions on how much mana must be transferred and where it should be directed to create, let's say, a flame of a certain size. Mages must maintain a store of mana inside their body at all times, and learn to properly manipulate it using runes. Maxi's hands flew across the pages as she took notes. Ruth narrowed his eyes. Do you understand everything up to this point? Yes, but Maxi glanced at the pile of books he had placed on the desk, feeling frustrated. I still don't understand how it happens, or the principles behind it. Let me explain. Ruth scratched his head, thinking. He rolled up the diagrams and gathered up the books, stuffing all of them into his bag and clearing the desk. Then he produced a translucent stone from a small pouch. Take this, my lady. We'll start by practicing how to accumulate and use mana. What is this? A stone that assists with growing mana affinity. It absorbs mana from its surroundings and emits heat. Hold it in your hand and try to discern the subtle flow of mana around it. Over time, your mana affinity will grow stronger, and you'll be able to perceive its movements. Please practice with the stone and read these books. He handed her 3 heavy tomes as he spoke. Comprehending the principles of magic requires geometry and metrology, not just arithmetic. As Maxi thumbed through one of the books, what little confidence she had deflated. Its pages were dense with cramped texts. Remembering Ruth's words about persistence, Maxi recalled her fantasies from the previous night. She imagined Riftan beaming at her as she accompanied him on his adventures, and she pictured herself dressed in the magnificent garb of a mage, traversing mountains and fields. Her courage rekindled. Maxi took the magic stone from Ruth. And that's it for chapter 8. Oh, God. Next time we will be reading chapter 9. Here we go. That is Under the Oak Tree, Volume 1 by Suji Kim. That was chapter 8 that we just read. If you would like to listen to the previous chapters, check out my YouTube at LadyCodyBug T. And that'll be the end of that for today. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hi, sweet girl. And to do.